Welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study for the Oaks West Church of Christ. We finished up 2 Peter last week, and so this week we're going to do a little bit of an introduction before we start looking at the book of Isaiah. I've not taught the book of Isaiah in a class before, so this is going to be a little bit new for me in putting all this together. However, some brethren have written some very good resources and some commentaries that are very helpful, and I will try to share some of those resources with you along the way. But for today, I just want to do a little bit of an introduction, some background information, and give you a little bit of a structure of how this class is going to go. But when we think about Isaiah, traditionally, it's dated to about 740 BC. During this time, Israel and Judah both have forgotten God, and they've fallen into a state of corruption and decay. They both had experienced a period of prosperity as Israel and Judah had restored much of their borders before the time of Isaiah. Now in Israel, idolatry had been rampant since the time of Solomon, and he died at about 931 BC. When the kingdom separated, Israel set up two golden calves, one at Dan and one in Bethel. This was done under the reign of Jeroboam. In addition, Baal worship became prevalent during the time of Ahab and Jezebel. The judgment of God was coming because of this apostasy. Now, just before the time of Isaiah, there were two prophets that were sent by God to cry against the sins of his people and plead with them to return to him. Amos was the first, declaring that judgment was coming, just as we will see from Isaiah. So terrible was this coming judgment that Isaiah described it as sheer terror to understand the message in Isaiah 28 verse 19. Now a few years after Amos came Hosea, and Hosea preached against the sins of the people, describing it as whoredom with false gods. Included in his message, though, was the possibility of mercy from God. In Hosea 4 and verse 1, he describes the terrible state of the nation as there is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. And despite the possibility of mercy, the condemnation of God was described again in chapter 13 and verse 16 as they shall fall by the sword, their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. So you see why Isaiah was describing this as sheer terror to understand this message. Well, we also need to have a little bit of background about Assyria. Assyria was a very powerful nation with extensive trade routes and colonies. They became known for their cruelty upon those whom they conquered. They burned cities, they beheaded large numbers, and they generally just tortured people to death. Coming up to the time of Isaiah, Assyria had grown into a major military power, and it was striking terror in the hearts of their enemies due to that cruel nature. They did go through a period of about 40 to 50 years where their power waned due to a plague that swept through the country. And it was during that time that God sent Jonah to Nineveh. Now, Assyria is important to our study in order to understand the terror of Hosea's prophecy, as well as God using a sinful people to carry out his judgment upon these nations. Now, when we think about Isaiah, we really don't know a whole lot about him or about his personal life. We do know that his name means salvation of the Lord, or the Lord is salvation. And that's very appropriate since he was commissioned to point people toward the Lord, the only source of salvation. Now, according to chapter 8 of Isaiah, he was married to a prophetess. And with her, he had two sons who had prophetic names as well. I'll probably butcher these pronunciations, but the first one was Shear-Jashub, which was a remnant shall return, and the second was Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, which means plunder speedeth or spoil hasteth. Now there are some indications that Isaiah did write some other things, but we don't have those saved for us today. They would have been some historical accounts of Uzziah and Hezekiah. Those have not survived to modern day, and knowing the providence of God regarding the saving of his inspired scriptures, I would say that it was merely just his own thoughts being saved, but I can't really say anything with any surety. Now, having given this introduction, I want to encourage you to read the whole book of Isaiah. It will be helpful to you to try to do that, and if possible, do that in one sitting. I know that's difficult to do with as long as the book of Isaiah is. It's one of the longest prophetic books in the Old Testament. If you can't do it in one sitting, try to do it in decent-sized chunks so you get more of the overall picture that Isaiah is communicating. Once you've done that, then look at chapter 1 and chapter 2 for us to study on next week's lesson. I know this was a quick recording today. I didn't want to give you too much to start off with until you've had the opportunity to read through Isaiah and prepare yourself for the study. So again, please read through the book of Isaiah over the course of the next week, and then we will start looking at it in detail at that time. Thank you very much for coming today to hear this recording. Would ask that you continue in prayer that God may be with us all during this very trying time, and that soon we will be back together meeting at our normal scheduled times.